Hi everybody, here with a second video for Criteria C, all about organizing and structuring your analysis. I did the first video and then sat down to do my revisions and figure out what I would move where and how I might restructure my analysis. Based on your feedback, it was very evident to me that I need to make my two texts connect more. I need to address my global issue more, but I need to make sure that I am comparing these two texts, not just talking about each of them separately, but trying to compare them. And that can be really tough. If I were to use the weave structure that we talked about in the last video, I need to make sure that the pieces that I weave together connect in some way. And I was struggling with this because in my topics, all of the intentional elements that I analyze are different from each other. So like I mentioned in the last video, if you are analyzing a metaphor in one text and a metaphor in the second text, then you can easily weave those two moments together because they're both about metaphor, right? But if you don't have that easy connection, it's a bit harder. So I want to show you how I broke mine down to get to a weave plan. So I started by identifying my social issue at the top there, loneliness and isolation. And I just kind of put there quickly that focus, which is like these authors are addressing how to cope through the pain of loneliness and isolation. I have both of my texts, Eilish and Murakami. And in both texts, I identified two intentional elements, just like you will be. So I just really simply wrote these out so I could see and understand what was what. So in Murakami, the first intentional element I reference is his references to light, things being illuminated. And I present in my findings that this is about hope and moving forward. Secondly, the intentional element Murakami talks about is the indirect metaphor, where he compares the shipyard to the girl. And really the shipyard's like broken and run down and beat up, and frankly, so is she. In Eilish, my two intentional elements were number one, a focus on space and location. For example, she sort of uses this moment to treat the loneliness and isolation as a place in her head. And so she almost describes it as though it is a setting. The second intentional element is that she personifies the mind and talks about it as though it's like a destructive being, like that something she has to hide from, something that is trapping her to a certain degree. Okay, so notice all four of the intentional elements that I am analyzing aren't really the same thing. So for me to weave these together, I have to really be considerate about why I'm weaving them. So then what I did was I took a look at, okay, what do I have here, right? Well, in this moment, the references to light, this is like about moving forward, right? How to go forward. And then here, when she personifies the mind, she talks about, when you feel trapped by this mind, especially when it's in this dark place, you need to make it lovely. You need to make a home of it. So in a lot of ways, that is also a way to move forward, right? So what I see between these two ideas is this piece here of my analysis. And this is the idea that coping, right? That both of these authors address a way to cope with the loneliness and isolation. Murakami does this through references to light, and then Eilish does this through a personification of the mind. Okay, and then when I look at these two, in this moment, he's just sort of describing her and how broken she looks, and she's comparing that to the shipyard. So for me, this is sort of like about what loneliness looks like on this character. Okay, and then same here, Eilish is talking about her loneliness being a space in her head, a place. So again, it's sort of giving me an understanding of what loneliness is like for her. And so if I match these two ideas, then now we have something about just simply like, what is it? And how do they experience it? So now when I weave these together, if I start talking about Murakami and how this girl is being compared to a shipyard because she's broken and she's sad and lonely, I could say comparingly, we also see an understanding of what it means to be lonely and to be isolated. In Eilish's song, she treats that as like a place that one arrives at and almost feels trapped in, right? And then when I move on to my second point, I could say that both authors suggest a way through this, though. Like, it's not all lost. It's not hopeless for people, that there is a way through loneliness and isolation. Murakami suggests that you have to have hope in this idea of moving forward and shining a light on the dark parts of yourself. And Eilish suggests that you treat this place that you might be stuck in almost like a home. Make something beautiful out of it and make it lovely, right? So now I've woven those ideas together. I've mentioned loneliness and isolation a lot more, and I've connected how the two texts are alike. To sort of tie off this whole thing, if I were looking at this in terms of my just breakdown in general, I'm going to start my analysis, right, with my thesis. That's going to be my number one thing. And then I need to make sure before I dig into these texts that I address the context of my issue. I need to talk about that this is an issue, somehow prove that it's a global issue, something that we should be concerned about. And then I can move down into actually analyzing my two texts. When I think about what would go first, second, third, fourth, and fifth for me, where'd my black pen go? I lost it. There it is. Obviously, this is going to be 1. This is going to be 2. Then I'm going to address, when I look at these topics, I have what is loneliness and isolation, what's the experience like, and what one should do to cope with it. So the coping is sort of my big kicker point here towards the end. That's really where this all gets tied together. So when I'm thinking about structuring something for appeal and that buildup of interest and of evidence, I think the coping thing is sort of my final point to go home with. Like, I think it should become towards the end of my analysis, and I should start with simple context, right? How do these two authors explain what it's like to go through this thing? So I'm going to start with Eilish. I'm going to have Eilish and this idea of space and location be the next thing I talk about. And then because these connect and I'm trying to weave, right, then my number 4 item is going to be the indirect metaphor. Okay, and then I'm ready to move on to my next intentional elements. So I was just on indirect. If I'm weaving, then now I need to go back to the other author, okay, and do this coping piece. So this is going to be my 5th item on my bullet list. This will then be my 6th item on my bullet list. All right, and then my 7th is going to obviously be my closing, which would include your final connections and restate your thesis in a new and fresh way, right? Don't just simply reuse the exact same sentence you used at the beginning, right? So if it helps you, and I can help you do this process if you're feeling stuck, but quickly and simply lay out what you're planning to do and then decide where do things connect or are similar in concept and how might you weave those if you do the weaving. If you don't do the weaving, you still might want to do this so that you understand the connection between the intentional elements in one text and the ones in the other, and you ensure that you talk about that to get that organization piece. All right? As always, email me with questions. Good luck. Keep revising.